The courtroom was full. Every seat was taken. Reporters stood along the back wall, their cameras ready. People whispered to each other, curious eyes turning to the front of the room. The trial had only just begun, but everyone knew it was going to be big. At the center of the room stood a tall, confident man. His name was Richard Crane, a billionaire, known all over the country. He wore a gray suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. He looked bored, almost amused, as if he had better things to do than sit in court. He adjusted his gold watch and smiled, like he already knew the result of the trial. His lawyers stood beside him, 3 of them, whispering and laughing softly. Then, the courtroom doors opened. Everyone turned. A woman walked in, Judge Amara Lewis. She was calm, dressed in a black judge's robe. She walked slowly but with purpose. She had dark brown skin, short hair, and eyes that looked like they had seen 1,000 storms, but never backed down from one. Some people in the crowd whispered, "Is that her? She's the judge? She looks too young. She won't last a week against Crane." Richard didn't stand when she entered. He just gave her a small, smug smile and leaned back in his chair. His body language said everything. "I'm not afraid of you." Judge Amara reached the front, stood behind her seat, and looked around the room. Her eyes didn't show fear. She didn't smile. She didn't speak yet. Then, she looked straight at Richard Crane. For a moment, the room felt heavy. Everyone felt it. The silence, the tension. It was as if something important was about to happen. And then, with a calm voice, she finally spoke. "Court is now in session." Everyone sat down. Amara slowly lowered herself into the judge's chair. Her back was straight, hands resting on the table in front of her. She looked at the lawyers, then at the jury, then once more at Richard. He still didn't take her seriously. "I hope we can move this along quickly, Your Honor," Richard's lead lawyer said. His voice was smooth, fake. "My client has a busy schedule. He's a man of great importance." There were small chuckles from Richard's side. His team smiled. They had done this before, many times. To them, this was just another trial, another judge, another weak case. Judge Amara didn't react. Instead, she leaned forward a little. Her voice remained soft, but it cut through the noise like a knife. "This courtroom is not run by importance. It is run by truth." The room went silent again. No one smiled now. Even Richard shifted slightly in his chair. "Mr. Crane," she said, her eyes fixed on him, "you are being accused of destroying lives for profit. Do you understand the seriousness of this trial?" Richard finally spoke, his voice filled with arrogance. "I understand I'm being targeted. That's what happens when you're successful, Judge. People try to pull you down." Judge Amara didn't blink. She didn't argue. She simply said, "You'll have your chance to speak when it's time. Until then, you will respect the process." Richard leaned back again. "We'll see." Behind her calm face, Amara's mind was clear. She had read every file, watched every video, studied every document related to this case. She knew what he had done. She had seen the faces of the people who had lost everything because of him: homes, jobs, futures. She had also seen the pattern. Richard Crane had always gotten away before. Every time someone tried to hold him responsible, the case would quietly disappear. Judges would step down. Lawyers would switch sides. Victims would be paid off or silenced. But this time was different, because now he stood in her courtroom. Amara wasn't afraid of his money, his power, or his smile. She had seen people like him before, and she had promised herself long ago she would never let people like him win without a fight. The crowd didn't know her story yet. They didn't know about the battles she had faced to sit in that chair. They didn't know about the long nights she studied while working 2 jobs. They didn't know how many times people told her, "You'll never make it." They didn't know how many doors were slammed in her face. But they would know soon. Because this case wasn't just about justice. It was about truth, respect, and courage. And Judge Amara Lewis was ready. The next morning, the courtroom filled again. People were still talking about Judge Amara's words from yesterday. Some thought she was brave. Others thought she wouldn't last long against a man like Richard Crane. But Judge Amara didn't care what people thought. She came in with the same calm face, the same quiet strength. Richard Crane, on the other hand, looked even more confident today. He sat with his legs crossed, wearing an expensive navy blue suit and a matching tie. He had a fresh haircut and a smile on his face, as if he were attending a party, not a trial. When Judge Amara entered, he didn't stand up again. Everyone in the courtroom did, but Richard stayed seated, leaning back, arms crossed. It was a small act, but a loud message. He didn't respect her. Amara noticed it, but she didn't say a word. She walked to her chair and sat down quietly. Her silence was powerful. Her eyes locked with Richard's again. No fear, no anger, just calm. As the first witness was called, Richard whispered something to his lawyer. The lawyer laughed softly, then turned to his assistant and repeated the words. The assistant chuckled. One of the reporters near them heard the whisper. She looks like she belongs in a church choir, not a courtroom. That line spread quickly. By lunchtime, it was already on social media. Some people laughed. Others were angry. But Judge Amara said nothing. She focused on the trial. The witness was a middle-aged man named David, a former employee of Richard's company. He had worked there for 15 years before suddenly being fired, along with hundreds of others. He stood nervously in the witness box. Mr. David, Amara said gently, please tell the court what happened. David's hands shook a little as he spoke. We were told the company was making changes. They said they had no money to pay us anymore. But we later found out it was a lie. The company was making more money than ever. They just wanted to move operations overseas and cut costs. Richard smiled while David spoke. He even whispered, boring, loud enough for the people near him to hear. When the witness finished, Richard's lawyer stood up. He didn't ask many questions. Instead, he made jokes. So you were fired, and you're still upset. You expect us to believe your story over a respected billionaire's records. Maybe you just weren't good at your job. Judge Amara leaned forward. Mr. Cole, she said to the lawyer, this courtroom is not a place for mockery. If you cannot be professional, you may sit down. The lawyer cleared his throat. Apologies, Your Honor. Richard rolled his eyes. After the break, the courtroom heard from another witness, a woman named Rosa. She had worked as a cleaner in one of Richard's buildings. Her voice cracked as she spoke about losing her job and her home. My daughter had to leave school, she said quietly. We had nowhere to go. Judge Amara nodded softly. Thank you for your honesty, Ms. Rosa. But Richard leaned forward, his voice louder now. Excuse me, Judge, he said. How long are we going to listen to sob stories? Gasps filled the room. Even his lawyers looked surprised. Amara stared at him. Mr. Crane, you will remain silent unless spoken to, she said firmly. I have the right to speak, he replied. You do, she said, her voice steady, but not to insult those who have suffered because of your decisions. Richard laughed. Suffered? They should thank me for ever giving them a job. The room went completely quiet. Everyone looked at Judge Amara. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't show anger, but her words hit hard. Mr. Crane, she said, your money has bought you many things in life, but it will not buy you dignity here. That must be earned. Later that evening, news channels ran the headline. Judge Lewis silences billionaire in court. Respect must be earned. Social media was on fire. Some people mocked Richard. Others praised Judge Amara for staying strong and calm. But inside her chambers, Amara sat alone, looking at the file in front of her. Her hands rested on the photo of another woman, her mother. She whispered, they think I don't belong here, Mama, but I do, and I will prove it. Outside, the courtroom buzzed with talk and tension, but inside Amara's heart, a quiet fire burned. She would not break. She would not back down. Not now. None ever. That night, Judge Amara Lewis didn't go home right away. The courtroom lights were off. The reporters had left. Even the security guards were gone for the night. But she stayed behind, sitting in her quiet chambers, a small lamp glowing beside her desk. In her hand, she held a photo, old, worn, and faded. It showed a little girl with 2 long braids, smiling while holding a school trophy. Next to her stood a woman in a nurse's uniform, her mother. Amara looked at the photo for a long time. Then she slowly placed it back in the drawer, locking it. No one in that courtroom knew her full story. Not the lawyers, not the reporters, and definitely not Richard Crane. They only saw a judge. They didn't know what it took to become one. Years ago, long before she ever stepped into a courtroom, Amara had lived in a small one-bedroom apartment with her mother and younger brother. Her father had left when she was 6. Her mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning during the day and taking care of elderly patients at night. Amara remembered those nights when she stayed up late, helping her brother with homework by candlelight during power cuts. She also remembered the shame. The kids at school who laughed at her second-hand clothes. The teacher who once told her, "Girls like you don't become lawyers." The grocery store manager who refused to hire her mother because of her skin color. But even through all that, her mother would smile and say, "One day, Amara, they'll have to listen to you. And when they do, speak with truth." That promise became her strength. The next day, the courtroom was even more crowded. News about Richard's disrespect had spread. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Richard entered with the same smug smile, but something was different. People didn't laugh with him anymore. The crowd had started to shift. There were whispers now, quiet ones. She's not scared of him. She's standing her ground. She's different. Amara walked in calmly. As always, she looked directly at Richard. This time he stood. Slowly. But he stood. It wasn't out of respect. It was because he knew this judge wasn't going to be easy to break. The third witness was called. Her name was Clara, a former secretary at one of Crane's companies. She was in her early 30s, but her face looked tired, worn. Clara spoke softly, but her words carried pain. "I was told to delete certain emails," she said. "Emails that showed the company lied to investors. When I refused, I was fired. They told me no one would believe me." Richard's lawyer jumped up. "Objection. This is hearsay." Judge Amara raised her hand. "Overruled, let her finish." Clara looked down at her hands. "After that, I couldn't find another job. They ruined my name. I lost everything." She paused, her voice cracking. "I was even thinking of ending everything." The courtroom froze. Judge Amara leaned forward, her voice gentle. "But you didn't." Clara looked up. "No, because I saw a news article about a black woman who became a federal judge, about how she never gave up." Tears formed in her eyes. "I saw you, and I thought, maybe truth still matters." A long silence followed. Even Richard didn't smile this time. After court ended, Amara sat alone again in her chambers. She opened her drawer, took out that same photo, and whispered, "Mama, they're listening now." She wasn't just fighting for justice. She was fighting for every person who had been silenced, for every mother who worked 2 jobs, for every girl who was told, "You don't belong." But while the courtroom was beginning to shift, Richard Crane wasn't finished. That night, in a tall glass building with golden lights, he sat with his lawyers in a private room. "She's a problem," he said coldly. "She's getting attention. We need to find her weakness." One of the lawyers hesitated. "You sure about that? The public's on her side." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Everyone has a past. Find hers." The next morning, Judge Amara stood in front of her mirror, brushing her hair slowly. She looked calm, but her mind was heavy. There had been a strange envelope slipped under her office door the night before. No name, no return address. Just a single piece of paper inside with 6 words written in bold black ink. "You should know when to stop." She stared at the words for a long time, then folded the paper, locked it in her drawer, and whispered, "Not today." Back in the courtroom, people noticed something was different. The air was tighter, the mood more serious. Reporters spoke in hushed tones. The guards were more alert. Even Richard Crane didn't smile as much. He had heard what was happening outside. News stories were turning. Public support was shifting. His company's name was being dragged into headlines like "The judge who refused to bow," "The billionaire who mocked the wrong woman." He didn't like it. He wanted control back. Richard's legal team brought in a new strategy. They were no longer smiling or making jokes. Instead, They were serious, sharp, and cold. They started questioning every detail of every witness's story. How do we know she was really fired? Where is the proof he said that? Isn't it possible that just bitter ex-workers? They tried to twist every word. Judge Amara allowed them to speak, but she was watching them carefully. Her gavel rested in her hand, not banging it, but holding it, quietly, like a warning. During the afternoon session, a new witness arrived. His name was Marcus Dane, a former financial officer in one of Richard's companies. He was calm, well-dressed, and carried a briefcase. "I have documents," he said, "emails, receipts, and private memos that show fraud." Gasps filled the room. Richard leaned forward. For the first time, his hands gripped the desk. Judge Amara asked, "Mr. Dean, are you saying Mr. Crane knew about illegal actions and approved them?" "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus said. "He didn't just approve them, he ordered them." Outside the courtroom, the news spread like fire. Hashtags filled social media. Videos of Amara's calm reaction went viral. But the spotlight came with danger. That evening, as she returned to her apartment, she noticed a car parked across the street. Same one from yesterday. A black SUV. Tinted windows. Engine always running. She walked slowly, not showing fear. Inside her apartment, the lights flickered once. Then again. Then, the power went out. Total darkness. Amara stood still in the hallway. She reached for her phone, only to find it had no signal, not even Wi-Fi. Her heart beat louder, not in fear, but in focus. She took a breath, then walked calmly to her desk and lit a candle. She wouldn't stop. Not now. The next morning, Amara arrived at the courthouse early. She handed the note she had received to the head of court security. "I'm not asking for help," she said. "I'm just letting you know. I'm ready for whatever comes." The guard nodded, speechless. That day, more people arrived to watch, even people who weren't connected to the case. Young law students, retired workers, mothers with daughters. They came to see the woman who wouldn't be shaken. But Richard Crane was ready too. He had hired a private investigator, and that man had found something, a document buried deep in the system. Something from Amara's teenage years, a sealed case, a small arrest, a mistake she had never spoken about. Richard smiled when he saw the paper. Let's see what the world thinks of their perfect judge now. Back in court, just before the session began, Amara's clerk approached her. "Ma'am," she said nervously, "this just came in, anonymously." Amara opened the file. She froze. It was her secret. The one she never shared with anyone. Her hands didn't shake, but inside, something cracked. She looked up and saw Richard's eyes. He smiled. The courtroom was quiet again, but this silence was different. Not the silence of respect. This time, it was the silence before a storm. Judge Amara sat on the bench, her face calm, but inside, her heart was racing. In her hand, she held the file Richard Crane's people had sent. It was from when she was 16. A police report, a shoplifting charge. One night, years ago, she had tried to steal a box of medicine for her younger brother. He had a fever, and her mother had no money. The pharmacy had refused credit, so Amara, scared and desperate, had slipped it into her coat pocket. She was caught. The case was sealed. The judge at the time understood her situation. She was released, and her record wiped clean. But now it was back, used like a weapon. That morning, before court started, Amara went to her chambers and looked at herself in the mirror. No robe, no title, just Amara, the scared girl, the strong woman, both living in one body. She knew what Richard wanted. He hoped she would panic, step down, hide. But she remembered her mother's words. When truth is hard, that's when it matters most. When court resumed, the air was different. People had started whispering. The press had received the leaked file. It was already online. Social media was full of messages. Some showed support. Others? Cruel judgment. A thief in a judge's chair. Is she even fit to serve? Another fake hero exposed. Richard Crane was smiling again. His lawyers whispered behind their hands. And for a moment, it seemed like Amara might fall. But then she stood, removed her robe, and faced the courtroom without it. She walked down from the bench. All eyes followed her. Even the cameras zoomed in. She stood in front of everyone and said, "Before this trial goes any further, there's something I need to say." The room went still. She took a breath and began. "When I was 16 years old, I stole a box of cold medicine." Murmurs. Gasps. She continued, voice steady. "My little brother had a fever. My mother had just worked 2 shifts. We had no money. I made a bad choice. But I wasn't a criminal. I was a child trying to protect her family." She looked at the crowd. "That one mistake taught me the power of truth. That's why I became a judge. Not because I'm perfect, but because I know what it means to be powerless." The room was frozen. Reporters weren't even typing, just listening. She stepped back toward the bench and said clearly, "Now, if anyone still thinks I don't deserve the seat, speak now." Not a single voice answered. Richard Crane looked stunned. His lawyers looked panicked. One of them whispered, This is backfiring." He growled. She turned a weakness into strength. Later, outside the courthouse, people gathered in silence. A woman held up a sign, "We stand with Judge Amara." A young man shouted, "Tell us the truth, and we'll stand with you." The crowd cheered. That evening, the news was everywhere. Judge admits teenage mistake, wins hearts. Truth over power. A courtroom story. And deep in his office, Richard Crane watched the TV screen in anger. His plan had failed. But he wasn't done. Not yet. That night, Amara sat in her apartment. Her brother called. "I saw it all," he said. "You were brave." She smiled, voice low. "I was scared. You didn't show it." She looked out the window. The black SUV was gone. But she knew the fight wasn't over. There were still witnesses to hear, still evidence to show, still a billionaire trying to silence truth. The next day, the courtroom was packed tighter than ever. People had waited outside since early morning, holding signs, whispering prayers, and hoping to witness something rare, the fall of a man who thought he could never lose. Inside, Judge Amara walked in wearing her robe again. She stood taller. She looked stronger. And she spoke louder. "This court will continue," she said, "because justice is not afraid of power." Richard Crane, sitting with his lawyers, no longer looked amused. His smile was gone. His face looked tired, angry, nervous, because his walls were breaking. Marcus Dean, the former finance officer, returned to the stand. But this time, he wasn't alone. 2 more former employees had joined him, a female accountant who had once been fired for asking too many questions, and a former factory manager who had been told to hide the real numbers. All 3 of them had brought proof. Emails, bank transfers, fake invoices, money trails leading straight to Richard's signature. The courtroom listened in silence as document after document was placed on the screen. "This proves he took investor money and moved it to personal accounts," Marcus said. "This shows his company charged workers for safety gear, then never gave it to them," the factory manager added. "This," the accountant said, holding up a printed page, "is a report he had changed to cheat the stock market." The judge didn't speak for a moment. Then she asked only one thing. "And are you all willing to swear that these are true?" Each of them stood and said, "Yes, Your Honor." Richard Crane's lawyers looked shaken. They whispered frantically. Finally, one of them stood up and said, "We request a pause. We need to speak to our client." Judge Amara nodded. 15 minutes. The courtroom murmured as Richard was led to a side room with his legal team. Inside, his voice rose quickly. "What is this? You said this would never come out." One lawyer answered, "Sir, we told you. Those documents should have been destroyed. Then why are they holding them in court?" The lawyer looked him in the eye and said, "Because truth doesn't burn as easily as paper." Back in the courtroom, Amara took a sip of water. Her hands were calm, but she could feel the shift in the room. It was like the wind had changed direction. The crowd that once stared at Richard with admiration now stared with anger. The cameras no longer showed a man of wealth. They showed a man crumbling. When the break ended, Richard returned to his seat, but not with the same pride. His shoulders were lower, his face was pale. Then, Judge Amara did something unexpected. She looked directly at Richard and said, "Do you wish to speak?" The courtroom gasped. Even his lawyers looked confused. But Richard, strangely, stood, and for the first time in this trial, he spoke himself. "I have nothing to say," he began, "except, maybe, I thought I was untouchable." He looked at Amara. "At first, I laughed at you, a woman from nowhere, a judge no one knew, a person I didn't respect." He paused. "But now I see. You didn't need power. You already had something stronger." "What's that?" Judge Amara asked. Richard looked down. "Honor." Gasps filled the room. But Amara didn't smile. She simply said, "This court will resume tomorrow for final evidence and closing statements." Bang. Gavel down. Session over. Outside, the media swarmed. Did he just confess? Is this the end of Crane Industries? Will she put him in jail? But Amara said nothing. She walked to her car with quiet grace. Her driver asked, "Did you ever think this day would come?" She looked at the sunset and replied softly, "Not this way, but maybe it's the only way it could." That night, Richard sat in his mansion alone. His phone buzzed with news alerts. Stock crashes. Board members resign. Crane Company under investigation. He had wealth. He had homes. But now, for the first time, he had no control. The sun rose slowly on the final day of the trial. A line of people stood outside the courthouse, waiting silently. Some held signs with her name. Others just held hands. Inside, the air was heavy. This was not just a trial anymore. It was history. The cameras were ready. Reporters whispered into microphones. And at exactly 9 o'clock a.m., Judge Amara stepped into the courtroom. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. But her eyes, they held power. Richard Crane sat at the defense table, his lawyers beside him. He didn't speak. He didn't smirk. He just stared at the floor. The once powerful billionaire was now just another man, waiting for judgment. Judge Amara's voice rang clear as she began. "This court has heard the evidence. We have seen the papers, heard the voices, and watched the truth unfold." She paused and looked around. Mr. Crane used his wealth to silence workers, steal from investors, and damage the lives of many. And when justice came to his door, he tried to break it. The courtroom was frozen. No one moved. No one breathed. "But justice," she continued, "is not a thing you can buy. Not in this courtroom. Not in this country. And not in front of these people." She turned her eyes toward Richard. "Do you wish to say anything before I give my verdict?" He stood slowly. His voice was quiet. "I made mistakes," he said, "and I thought I could get away with it. But I can't change what I've done." He looked at the judge, not with hate, but with something close to regret. "I'm ready to accept whatever you decide." Amara nodded. Then she stood. "In the matter of Richard Crane, this court finds the defendant." A pause. The world held its breath. "Guilty on all charges." Gasps. Tears. Cheers. Cameras flashed as the courtroom filled with noise. People cried. Reporters rushed out to break the news. And in the center of it all stood Judge Amara, calm, steady, unshaken. Justice had spoken. Outside, the world changed in real time. Headlines exploded. Crane found guilty. Justice prevails. Black woman judge becomes symbol of hope. Truth over power. A verdict for the people. Social media flooded with her name. Young girls posted her picture. Mothers shared her words. Lawyers, teachers, and factory workers spoke one sentence together. She didn't back down. Back in her chambers, Amara removed her robe and hung it gently. She sat by the window, watching the crowd outside chant her name. But her voice was quiet as she spoke to her assistant. "It was never about the man," she said. "It was always about the message." Her assistant asked, "What message?" Amara looked out again. "That we see you. That truth matters. That justice still works for everyone." Later that night, Richard Crane was taken away in handcuffs, not in silence, but with cameras recording every step. Meanwhile, Judge Amara sat alone at her kitchen table, the same small table from years ago, the same tiny apartment. She opened a letter. It was from a young girl, just 12 years old. It said, "Dear Judge Amara, I want to be brave like you one day. Thank you for fighting for people like my mom and me." She smiled, tears touching her cheeks. She didn't need a trophy. She didn't need headlines. Because this letter, this was her true reward.